Hi, welcome to the ProPublica podcast. I'm Joe Sexton, a senior editor at ProPublica, and I'm here today with Ian Urbina of the New York Times. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks.
Ian has just authored what, for me, has been one of the more extraordinary investigative series. And there's an old saying in journalism that, there are no new stories. Everyone's been done before. But actually, I don't know that this has ever been done before. The series was called The Outlaw Ocean, and it is a wild world you uncovered, Ian. In the first installment, the piece says, through debtor coercion, tens of thousands of workers, many of them children, are enslaved on boats every year with only occasional interventions. On average, a large ship sinks every 4 days, and between 2,000 and 6,000 seamen die annually, typically because of avoidable accidents linked to lax safety practice. Ships intentionally dump more engine oil and sludge into the oceans in the span of 3 years than that spilled in the Deepwater Horizon and Exxon Valdez accidents combined, ocean researchers say, and emit huge amounts of certain air pollutants, far more than all the world's cars. Commercial fishing, much of it illegal, has so efficiently plundered marine stocks that the world's population of predatory fish has declined by 2/3. That's a pretty staggering set of findings. I'm really interested first, how'd you get interested in it? And then recognizing the kind of daunting task of reporting on such a roguish world, much of which is beyond the reach of countries and law enforcement. How did you conceive of attacking it?
So about a decade ago, when I was in grad school, I took some time off and worked on a ship. It was harbored in Singapore. And it was just a sort of wild-eyed idea I had to get away from the cold winters of Chicago. And I had long been enamored with the idea of going out to sea. And that stint was only 3 months, but it really kind of whetted my appetite. And I guess I was most struck by this sort of strange insular tribe of seafarers who are right there among us, but kind of live in this divorced world. So I kind of had always been scheming about getting back there and journalistically kind of trying to go out with them and tell their stories. And then just the reporting, as you well know, these things sort of emerge en route. So we just took one story at a time. And the first story we reported on was sea slaves. And it was a story that took me out to the South China Sea. And the goal there was there has been some really good reporting about the forced labor problem, especially in those waters, Thai flagged vessels. But most, if not all, the reporting has been done on land. And there hadn't, from what I could tell, been an attempt to actually get on some of these boats and see what it's like out there. So that was sort of our goal.
In reading the series, you're often uncertain but curious to know, what reporting was the fruit of actually being on the vessels and what was the fruit of some intrepid piecing together of records and radio transmissions and victim testimony and law enforcement actions, etc. Did you actually get on a slave ship?
Yeah, so, this whole slave term is a really loaded one, so one wants to be really careful about using it. But so when we use it, we're referring to these workers that are essentially slaves in that they can't leave the boat. They're indentured, so they have a debt that keeps them there. And the violence and sort of discipline over them on these boats is severe, to put it mildly. So I think slave is a safe term. But yes, we got on a boat, we being Adam Dean, this amazing photographer that joined me on that reporting. And essentially to get out there, the biggest challenge was actually we hopscotched our way out. And we'd figured out that you want to get about 250 miles out because the territorial waters end and you enter high seas at that point. And that's where the real rogue characters operate. It's also where the boats stay out there a really long time, sometimes for years, and they never come back to port. And those long-haul transshipment boats that stay out there are the ones where there were notorious slave conditions. And so our thought was, let's try to get out there. We thought, we'll just pay a captain, he'll take us out there. It didn't work out that way. We hopscotched from boat to boat to boat, usually with one captain taking us 50 miles out, talking to another captain, getting us on the next boat, 50 more, so on. And so we spent 2 days on one boat. We found a really kind of telling boat, and it was a Thai flagged vessel. It had about 42 Cambodian boys and men mostly catching small fish for pet food and other livestock feed. And these guys have been out there for over a year. All of them were indentured, and the conditions were pretty horrific.
And how, so having hopscotched your way out there, there must come a moment in time in which you want to board the subject vessel. How do those negotiations or conversations take place?
In a foreign language, like, so somewhat out of my reach. We had a translator with us, Adam and I, and essentially what we'd set up was the hardest jump was the first, from port to first boat, because Thailand's been taking a lot of heat on this slave labor problem. And so there are a lot of eyes on these guys when they're in port and on land. And the guys on land know what's up. They're reading the newspapers. They know what a human rights worker or an advocate or a reporter looks like, and to be wary of them. So getting the first captain to take us 50 miles out was tough. And we ultimately couldn't get anyone to do it, so we had to take a rubber dinghy out 10 miles. And that captain, who we met at a bar, would pick us up out there so no one would see us get on his ship. And then he took us 50 miles out. And essentially with that first captain, we said, we'll pay you a rate, for meals and food and fuel. And then you negotiate terms with the subsequent boats. But, we're going to pay you to take us on board. And what we seek to do is this. And from then on, it was that captain who negotiated us onto the next boats. And we never knew what terms he was setting up or how much he was looking out for us, frankly. But we had sized him up and we felt like we're okay.
But when you get on the slave ship, if that's a fair term, who did they understand you to be, and were they cool with that?
Yeah. I mean, we were reporters and we were wanting to document the work they do, period. Just as you were an editor of mine years ago, and I learned a lot from you. And, sometimes being sparse is the best way to go. And frankly, the further out we got, the more they were bemused as to why the hell we would want to get on their rat and roach infested ship. And essentially the captain only cared that we stayed out of his guy's way, but he didn't have the instinct that we were a threat, because those guys, again, they're staying out there and they're not taking any heat from law enforcement.
Right.
So
They seem pretty inured to the idea of threats. I like to say this occasionally, but I worked at the New York Times for a while, and I've been away for a couple of years, and I am admiring of much of the work that goes on there. And then there are some moments in which I'm genuinely jealous. And this series provoked that kind of jealousy. I mean, it's just such a intriguing and outrageous world. I mean, I was rereading the series this morning in preparation, and, there are things known as James Bond license plates, magic pipes that are used for illegal dumping. There are exploding fish. Messages are being sent in bottles. Slaves are shackled by the neck. There are still mutinies. In that quite extraordinary world, what actually was the most sort of breathtaking thing for you?
It's I like how you plucked out kind of some of the best snapshots. It's hard to pin down my favorite or the most daunting. There was a moment when, in that weird sort of way that only a reporter will get, where I was half bemused and half really afraid. And this was a moment in the fourth story that concerned this great chase that occurred. And our reporting challenge was, I was working with an African photographer who later found out didn't know how to swim and had never been to sea. And we were scrambling to catch up with the chasers, and they were not going to slow down for us. The deal was we could come on board, but we had to find a way out to them. So that was a really small window. And we had 48 hours from arriving into the African country that I won't mention because of an agreement I made with the government there that helped us get on these vessels. The first boat we got on to get out to sea was a port authority vessel. Essentially, these were port police. And these were all good guys, Navy guys, really kind of tough together seafarers. We went out with them, and they were gung-ho, and they were going to take us 150 miles out. At about 70 miles out, they panicked. Number one, we found out at that point that none of them except one had ever been out beyond 10 miles. So they had never seen swells that big. And it's like a Coast Guard vessel type size ship. So you can envision it's like 40 feet. And the swells were really big at 70 miles out. And they also realized that their anchor couldn't touch bottom. That it was so deep. And so that was a big problem because they had calculated how much fuel they needed, assuming we could drop anchor and sit. But in those swells, we couldn't sit, and we certainly couldn't sit if we couldn't drop anchor because it wasn't touching the bottom. And so they started really panicking, and this very heated argument broke out between our side, which were people that I'd won over to like continue the mission, and those who wanted to turn back. And it got physical. The guys were getting each other's faces, and I thought we were about to witness a mutiny because on my side was the captain and one first officer, and the rest of the crew wanted to go back. So that was dodgy. We lost the argument. We turned back. It's the middle of the night. We're now worried we're going to miss the entire story. And on the way back, we lost all power on the ship. And so these guys are not able to read the stars. They're not these sort of, sextant seafarers. And so we were almost out of fuel. We'd lost all power, and they couldn't figure out exactly what direction we were supposed to be heading to get back to port. And one little miscalculation, and you'll end up in another country's waters. You run out of fuel. And so for just 6 hours, we were drifting around the middle of the night, very tense. And that was the one moment when I thought, what a ridiculous way to go. I can't with these guys, on this boat floating in. So that was one of those moments where I thought maybe I bit off more than I could chew.
And
Yeah, a little dot on the horizon emerged. So I had the only access we had at that moment. There was no ship close enough to radio them. And the only other tether to the outside world we had was my satellite phone. But we'd run down its battery and we had 1 bar left, which was about 1 call left. So there's this great, in retrospect, it wasn't great at the time, but this decision to be made, who do we make our 1 call to? And it was, by the time difference, the middle of the night in the U.S. So who's going to take the call? And, I only get 1 shot at this. So I wanted to call a friend who had access to satellite data that could see us and perhaps tell us where to go. And I called her. And she pulled up the data, and I thought, oh, this is going to save the day here. And she was going through the data, and we realized that there's a lag time. I should have thought of this between the pinging of the data. And so she was seeing us 7 hours earlier than where we were. So it was useless, and then the phone went dead. But long story short, too late for that, but a fishing boat showed up on the horizon, and they flashed lights, and the boat came near and told us how to get back. We got back, and thus began the scramble to use the final 7 hours to get back out. And we did. We lucked out. We found someone.
Great stuff. I mean, we spend a lot of time at ProPublica concentrating on the idea of doing our best to ensure that our stories have real impact. It's not distinctive from what many news organizations do, but we do give it quite a bit of thought. Was there any worry on your part? I mean, since it seems a world so beyond morals and enforcement, that as vivid a series as you could do, as disturbing a series as you could do, that it might not lead to the kind of change you as a journalist would wish to see?
Yes. That was and still is a big concern about this topic and a lot of these types of topics. Some of the most interesting and tough to tackle are the ones that you can tell on the front end don't have clear metrics on outcome or fixes, and they're almost too broad. So I guess the mantra I had in my own head, reassuring myself that that's okay, other than it's just a great ride, was that there probably won't be any clear big fix to the whole system, but hopefully there will be, and starting to seem to be, little fixes here and there to isolated problems. So anti-trafficking legislation coming through the Hill now is scrambling to incorporate terms so that they are aware of the distinct problems as they play out at sea. They were kind of oblivious to that realm before in that legislation. That's progress. It's small, but countries, with these stowaways who were thrown overboard, Tanzanian government is looking into sort of trying to figure out whether they should set aside a fund and sort of a system for repatriating their people, because a lot of Tanzanians do this. They stow away so that they're not cut loose. So here and there, but I don't imagine for something like this there'll be one big outcome.
Great. Okay, so we'll wrap up. Thanks once again for coming. But something prevents me from not asking, did you get seasick?
I didn't. Every translator we brought on board did, and one of them to the point where we didn't have a translator. But the photographer and I think either you do or you don't. It's something, and I didn't know which way it would go, and I lucked out, and I was not prone to it.
But then you started the editing process at the New York Times, which you then became instantly seasick
That's
with
right.
those swells, right?
Quite right. That's right.
Anyway, congratulations, and thanks again for coming.
Thanks a lot.